Hello everybody, Kyle Stahl from Stahl Agronomy here, and it's going to be part of our segment we're going to call the Friday Morning Agronomist. I'm recording this on Thursday, August 16th. We're out here looking at some corn, just kind of checking out and see what's going on. And we've been looking at a lot of stuff this week. It's been actually a very, very busy week. Usually once we get into August, as an agronomist, especially when I was in retail, we kind of thought this was a little bit of a slow time. We're getting to the end of where insects and fungus will attack corn. We're getting towards the end of where insects and disease and everything else will attack soybeans. So now it's usually just kind of that lull time between now and when things fill out and we have harvest. But this week we actually had quite a flare up of aphids in some areas of our territory, just walking through some fields. I did find some hot spots. The nice thing is soybean aphids for the most part are kind of down on the decline right now. I looked at a field that I was kind of worried about having to spray on Tuesday. Went back this morning and looked at it again, so basically 2 days later, and the aphid population was half of what it was 2 days ago. So for me, that means they're on the rapid decline. We're starting to get to the point where soybeans are going to start getting past damaging from aphids. They're starting to fill the pods. We're pretty close to R6 in a lot of fields. So for most part, soybeans are kind of out of the woods on aphids. We're getting towards the end of that. As far as corn goes, we're not really seeing much of anything in corn. The disease has been kind of slow this year. The only thing we're really seeing show up that's going to have some significant harvest implications is especially going to be anthracnose. We had a very, very good season of early anthracnose. We had a lot of anthracnose early on our corn. Now we're starting to see that show back up where we're starting to see some top dieback. So when you drive down the road, look down the rows, you can see some of the tops are starting to turn yellow on corn plants. The other thing I'm looking at in corn right now is we're starting to see a lot of tip back. And is it tip back or is it going to be where we miss the nick on pollination? And that's the kind of the $1,000,000 question when you're looking at this. So there's two ways that we're going to see the tips of corn plants or corn ears not develop. And what we're seeing is a lot of late pollination misses. So towards the end of our pollination. So to me, that means that we had maybe some insect feeding. Especially we had a lot of, I don't know if there was an even field from the end of May through early July in southeast Wisconsin. So a lot of these fields we had fairly uneven pollination. So when we're actually looking at some of these plants, my thought is a lot of these plants are pollinating late where we're starting to see some of this significant miss on pollination. So we have late flowering plants. They're in isolated pockets in the field. The rest of the field was pollinated. You've got rootworms, Japanese beetles feeding on silks. We've got fresh silk coming out. That's what they like to eat. So we had significant pressure in some of these areas of the field. So that's one of those things, you know, and a lot of those pockets are not right next to the road. They're kind of out further. So you're going to have to kind of seek some of those out. But we did see quite a bit yesterday when we were looking at some corn. Once you get out in the field and away from where some of those pockets were, they were fully filled all the way out to the tip. It was notably on one variety over the others that were in the field. So a lot of that I'm starting to think was pollination miss. The other thing we can see, and we have been seeing, is aborted kernels at the end of the year, or tip back, where we get it later in the season. Some of these plants are running out of nitrogen, running out of moisture, which is the case in some places. It's kind of all over the board. We had rain yesterday where it didn't rain where I was standing, and a mile up the road they had 1.5 inches. You go another mile up the road and they had 2 or 3 inches. So we've had a lot of those spotty rainfalls over the last few weeks. And on top of that, we had a lot of corn planted early, got early nitrogen on, then we got heavy rainfall right after. So now we're starting to see some corn run out of nitrogen. So the difference you'll see on those ears is on an ear that didn't fully get pollinated, you'll see there was never a kernel there. It just never developed. It was just, it'll be all white from the tip to the bottom to where the kernels actually are. Where we're seeing aborted kernels, right now you'll actually be able to see it. You'll actually see the kernels will still be kind of yellow, but they'll be shriveled up, and that's pretty much a really easy indication that we're getting tip back on that. So that's another thing, you know, there's a lot of stuff to go on out in the fields right now. And there's still clues right now. We did a newsletter about a week ago or earlier this week, and we talked about try not to do a postmortem. And the point with that being is right now the plants are still green. We still have some of the stuff here. There's a lot of clues out there as what's going on. You know, when we see tip back or kernel where we see misses on pollination, trying to determine between those two once we get to harvest, it's not very easy. I mean, basically it looks pretty much the same once we get to that point. Nitrogen deficiency, nutrient deficiencies in corn, those ears and everything else will be all brown. You're not going to be able to tell a whole lot of what happened there. The only thing I'll be able to tell you at harvest, and I've done it before, is compaction, and if we had like a shallow or a deeper planting depth, that's about it. I mean, once you get to that point, a lot of the clues are gone. And it's the same thing with soybeans. Right now we're looking at sudden death and brown stem rot. Once you get to harvest, you're not going to be able to tell which one of those you had. You know, it could be brown stem, it could be sudden death. You know, the foliar symptoms are very similar on both of them. The difference between the two is when you split the stems, you'll see that the actual, just inside the stem, will be brown on sudden death, and brown stem rot will actually be the pith will turn brown, the very middle of the actual plant itself. The other thing with sudden death that'll be an easy identifier for you is you'll see some kind of blue mold, blue fungus growing around the very base of the root once you get a little bit underneath the soil. That's another indicator of sudden death. You know, the other question we're getting with a lot of sudden death starting to show up is, I used the levo, why am I still getting sudden death? And it's a very valid question. Sudden death is going to be there no matter what you do. You're not going to kill it off. You're not going to completely control it. You're not going to take a variety of soybeans that has an extremely poor sudden death rating, put it in a heavy SDS infection area, and expect it to be a whole lot better. It's going to be better, but it's not going to be perfect. So there's going to be some kinks in its armor a little bit. So we're still seeing sudden death show up. The other thing is, a levo at a full rate is about 25 bucks a unit. So just figure $25 just for the levo. At most people's price points, that doesn't quite cut it. So a lot of guys were looking at $13 to $14. So if you're taking something that's $25 a unit, bringing it down to $13, $14, you can imagine what that does to the rate you're using. So we went out with half or low rates as far as what their spectrum goes for sudden death. So now you're starting to see some show up. So we're doing some good, but we're not going to completely get it off. The other thing is, in 2016, and a lot of people forget this, it's easy for us to remember in this area because our rotation really revolves around that. So 2016 was our horrible sudden death year. We saw quite a bit. There's a reason why we treated a lot of our beans with a levo this year, is because of 2016. For us, it's every even year we seem to have sudden death. The opposite effect is, on every odd year, we have white mold problems. So those fields that we go to next year are going to be white mold management for us. We'll still see some sudden death more than likely in those fields, but for the most part, we're kind of spreading, it seems like we're spreading our white mold around in the years we have white mold. And for whatever reason, if it's tillage or whatever else, we're starting to move some of our sudden death around to the fields that had sudden death. So we're kind of getting on that cycle. And I don't think that's going to end for a little while, but for the most part, you know, the easy explanation is you're still going to see sudden death in beans treated with a levo. The incidence is going to be less. You're going to see less of it in the field, and the effects should be fairly low. We're seeing sudden death show up this year with crops progressing fairly ahead of our 5 or 10 year averages. So right now we have beans that are nearing R6. We're getting late sudden death showing up. Those pods probably won't likely abort. They'll probably still put out a viable seed. You'll just see reduced seed sizes. The same thing happened to us in 2016. We had a crop that progressed fairly fast. We had plenty of sudden death out in fields. I had one variety against another. One was showing worse, and it still out yielded the variety that didn't show any or very little sudden death. So just because you're starting to see some sudden death show up in the fields doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a bad yield in that field. It's just going to be a management thing for you to consider next year. So stay tuned. We're going to start doing these every Friday, and I'll come back with another episode next week.